Once again, good morning, and we're going to begin this morning's session. I think we are delighted to have Sister Patricia Wittberg with us, a sister of charity from Cincinnati, who received her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago, taught at Fordham University, and Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis, and currently she serves as a research associate for the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, which is located at Georgetown University. She also is interested in the program, the Seton Enabling Fund. She is well-versed in issues facing the Catholic Church, and her scholarly work includes Catholic cultures on welcoming different cultures in our parishes, New Generations of Catholic Sisters, which is co-authored with another person from CARA, Pathways in Refounding Religious Communities, from piety to professionalism and back, and the rise and fall of the Catholic religious orders. Her professional associations, she is president of the Religious Research Association. She's former chair of the religion section at the American Sociological Association, and worked with the Review of Religious Research publication. I think that the great thing about Sister Patricia, and it's a rare find for us, is she's a very passionate advocate for creating dialogue among different aspects of the church community, especially young women. And her presentation today will focus on challenges facing religious communities in general, and she will highlight the major portions of the survey results. So I'm sure that her perspective, like last evening's talks, will provide much food for thought when we break into discussion groups. So Sister Patricia, thank you.
I will promptly forget I put that down there, and then I'll lose it. Okay. I'm both honored and kind of intimidated to be here. First of all, because I'm not an archivist, I'm not a historian, and I'm certainly not a religious leader of a congregation, heaven forbid. Also because, and by the way, I'm sure that my community would say heaven forbid too, okay. Also because I am not terribly fond of listening to papers that are read, and so I'm a little worried if I read this one, everyone will fall asleep, but I'm going to try and keep you awake. But I've been invited to talk about, first to report and analyze the surveys that many of you took, and then on a larger, to place it into the larger context of the Catholic Church and society in general, and hopefully therefore to convey some of my sense of, as you say, enthusiasm or passion about this. So, but I will try to read with emotion, expression, and depth of feeling, even though very often reading papers, that does not work that way. But as numerous historians have noted, institutes of religious life have experienced recurring cycles of foundations, growth, and decline over the centuries. From the desert monastics and the consecrated virgins of the 3rd through the 5th centuries, who at their height, there were some 10,000 men and 20,000 women in Egypt alone, in the deserts. I'm not too sure where they all hung out in the deserts, but that's beside the point. But after that, they had a precipitous decline. The monasteries of the early Middle Ages had several cycles of growth and decline that the historians among you are more familiar even than I am, sure. The mendicant orders flourished in the High Middle Ages, but decreased by 2/3 or more after the Reformation. The apostolic orders of the 17th century flourished and then declined in the 18th with the French Revolution. And then they had the teaching congregations of the 19th century. The history of religious life has been a cyclical one of extensive and rapid growth initially, followed by a century or more of stability, and then subsequent decay. Of all the religious orders founded before 1800, at least according to one author, 2/3 are now extinct. Those are the ones to be founded before 1800, because you had these cycles, and then, of course, a new batch were founded. And the foundation and decline periods of each cycle pose particular challenges for historians and archivists. In the initial period of what sociologists call white-hot mobilization, everybody's enthusiastic, the charismatic leader and the first members of a new religious order are often too preoccupied with issues of spreading the message, dealing with suspicious church leaders, and simply finding the financial wherewithal to survive, to worry about establishing or maintaining an archive of what they're doing. In the decline period, there might not be sufficient personnel or funds to maintain any archives that exist. And if an order disintegrates completely, its archives too may be lost. We are in such a period in North America and Western Europe today. The United States, which is where, working for CARA, I have mostly US figures, so apologies ahead of time to the Canadians and Scottish and wherever else, Ireland, all the other people that pointed this out last night. But in the United States, the number of sisters has declined by almost 3/4 since its height of 880,000 in 1966. The number of brothers has declined by more than 3/4. The number of religious order priests has declined by half. The median age of women religious has climbed into the mid to upper 70s. That's the median age. While the median age of male religious is in the upper 60s. Fewer than 10% of US sisters are under the age of 60, and the percentage is even lower in Canada. The total number of religious institutes in the United States, in CARA we call them religious institutes because you have to say congregations, orders, Society of the Apostolic Life, and by the time you've written all that in a sentence, it's too long. So we just say religious institutes, and that's what we mean. But anyway, the total number of religious institutes in the United States has also declined as formerly separate provinces or orders have merged or gone out of existence. In 1991, there were 1,010 communities of men and women religious that either had their central house in the United States or their a house of formation here. Today, there are only about 800, so it's gone from 1,010 to 800. As often happens with declining organizations, and my specialty, by the way, isn't religious sociology, it's organizational sociology. But in any case, as often happens with declining organizations, the number of religious orders or congregations has declined more slowly than the number of individual religious. And so therefore, the average size of an order has also shrunk, sometimes drastically. This is, by the way, not unusual among mainline Protestant denominations, like your Methodists, for example. The number of Methodists has declined faster than the number of Methodist congregations. So you had the same kind of shrinking thing. It's not unique to religious orders. A concomitant change that has taken place is the withdrawal of religious from their educational, healthcare, and social work institutions. These organizations may have their own archives, but their current administrators may not think to share the contents of these archives with the former community sponsor. And the organizations themselves may be in danger of dissolving or merging with another institution. For example, As a result of the declining birth rate over the past decade, with the Great Recession in 2007 and 8, we suddenly stopped having babies. As a result, there are now way fewer 10-year-olds. And in 8 years, there's going to be way fewer 18-year-olds. You don't make new 18-year-olds, you have to start from scratch. And so colleges believe me, colleges know this. I'm on the board of our own university, are going to be competing for a markedly smaller pool of potential students. It has been estimated that over half of the small Catholic colleges extant today in the United States may have to close within the next 10 or 20 years. The increasing complexity of healthcare and the medical reimbursement system is causing many hospitals to be swallowed up into large multi-state systems. This is very different from Canada. I realize Canada's got a totally different system, you lucky dogs. But anyway, in the United States, you end up with these big healthcare systems. What happens if to the archives of a Mercy College or a Franciscan hospital when it no longer exists as a separate entity? Still another change is in the ethnic composition of religious orders today. In previous eras, over 90% of the male and female religious in North America were of European descent, usually one particular European descent. So you had all German or all Irish or all Italian communities. Right down the road from my own congregation is the Oldenburg Franciscans, and I'm told that one of their sisters said once, this is several decades ago, that she knew when she entered the community she had to become a sister and adopt those, but she didn't know she also had to become a Bavarian peasant. This, by the way, she entered maybe in the 1950s, so this is no longer true today. Okay, but anyway, you get the idea. Today, on the other hand, 1/3 of the men and women in formation in the United States are of Hispanic or Asian background. In international orders, often find that the majority of their newer members are from Africa or South Asia. So the Jesuits, for example, I'm told, Jesuits can contradict me if I'm wrong, that their largest province is in India or Indonesia, I forget which, one of those places over there, U.S. orders, which established a mission overseas, now find that their members from these mission areas sometimes outnumber the American members. Eventually, religious from these other cultures will move into the leadership of their communities, and they may not have Western priorities for how to organize or preserve archives. In addition, there are many men and women religious currently residing in the United States who are members of institutes headquartered in Latin America, Africa, or South Asia. CARA is just finishing a book now that I helped work on of, quote, international sisters in the United States, and we found 4,000 of them. And again, these people, their mother houses in Nigeria or Vietnam or someplace, and their main archives are going to be there if they have them. And the effort there may be less effort expended to collect information from the American missions. And the archives, if they're located abroad, may be less accessible to scholars in this country or in North America in general. All of this, of course, has implications for the topic of this conference. As institutes of religious men and women decrease in size and their membership ages, their members may be unable to maintain their own archives. Finances for training a religious archivist in modern methods of arrangement, description, preservation, and selected digitization, you can tell I'm not an archivist, I can't say digitization without falling over my tongue, of their collection may not be available to a small and declining community, still less for the funds for the hiring of a professional lay archivist. Another complication arises if the formerly separate provinces of a religious order merge. It may be difficult to merge the archives, especially if each of the former provinces' archivists had different ways of cataloging things. Because archival records are unique and relational, Only an individual from the community or province of the origin can evaluate what's important. Merging archives will be even more difficult if it's not provinces that are merging, but whole separate institutes, as both some Dominican orders have merged together recently and the Sisters of St. Joseph have merged into a larger group. Merging archives and systematizing their contents is also expensive in time and money, neither of which may be available in the long term. Unsustainable merging projects may end up being abandoned halfway through, rendering useless what had already been done. Finally, the archives of communities that completely disappear, although I loved what the survey said. They didn't say communities that go belly up. They didn't say communities that croak. They said that reach completion, and I just thought that was a wonderful, I like that. But anyway, of communities that completely disappear, those archives might be deposited with a local diocese or sent to a central repository. However, due to the shortages of personnel and finances that probably accompanied the community as it was diminishing to non-existence, the archives may be in a mess by the time they go to the repository, and then who's going to systematize them there? All of these issues with the archives of declining communities are likely to be familiar to many of you here. People were nodding out there. And I hope that wasn't because they were falling asleep. Possibly better known to you than they are to me. But there's another issue as well. Since 1965, at least 200 new religious communities have been founded in the United States, and over 40 new religious communities have been founded in Canada. Of the US ones, close to half of those that were present in 1998 now no longer exist. CARA has done 3 now directories of new religious orders. The first one we did was in 1998. And now our most recent one was published last year. Over half the communities in the 1998 one no longer exist. And my guess is that there were also communities founded, say, in 1972 that died in 1985 and didn't even show up in our 1998 directory at all. And many more have descended. Okay, I said that. Still, however, our 2017 directory, this is the 3rd edition, lists 159 currently existing religious communities and lay ecclesial movements founded since 1965. Now, some of the lay ecclesial movements are rather large. They're charismatic prayer groups or whatever. But if you just pull out the ones that are either are or aspire to be a recognized canonical religious community, diocesan or whatever, they're quite small. The median number of their full members is 10. And only 5 of them have more than 60 full members. A large percentage of these new groups are either contemplative in focus or engage in non-institutional ministries such as evangelization, parish work, or ministry to the poor. Comparatively few, only 16%, are engaged in teaching. And when they are, they're rarely in settings other than a local parish school. Again, even fewer, 15%, are engaged in health care, and almost exclusively as hospital chaplains or in home health care. Few, if any, I can think offhand of only 2 of these new communities operate any institutions which they themselves own or sponsor. The Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist, have Spiritus Sanctus Academy. I believe they own and sponsor that. The Alma Mercies, Sisters of Mercy of Alma, Michigan, have a lot of clinics. They're very into health care, but it's clinics, not hospitals. Again, this has implications for any archives that these new communities may have or later develop. With half of them having a membership of 10 or fewer, and it's unlikely that they have made any provision for the collection and preservation of material that could later be organized into a coherent archive. Most of the members of the new communities work in less well-paying ministries, if they work outside of their monastery at all. This may limit their ability to hire an outside archivist. With a mortality rate of almost 1/2, Any founding material from some new communities may not be saved at all. And without sponsored institutions to keep separate archives, that source of material will also be unavailable. As Ginger Downing mentioned in last evening's session, I think we're all gathered here because we believe that the story of religious life is important for both the church and the larger society to know, and that the preservation of community archives is essential to this story. It is especially important for communities of women religious. To be blunt, the dominant societal picture today of women's role in the Catholic Church is not a good one. And the archives of women's religious congregations which could refute this picture are possibly the most precarious. The mainstream media in recent decades has largely depicted women religious as either sexually repressed or as silly and vacuous. And neither Catholics nor the public at large see many sisters in real life to counteract this image. If we do not tell our stories, we will lose control of it. Without the stories of women religious in professional and church leadership positions, the only ecclesial leadership role in Catholicism which is visible to the public is the ordained priesthood, which is restricted to males. Society at large will then assume that the church allows only subservient roles for half its members. This assumption is already having a negative effect on the church's appeal to women, even those who do not desire church leadership for themselves. Statistics indicate that young women in the United States who are raised Catholic are less likely than young adult males their age to remain in the church. They're less likely to attend Mass regularly. They're less orthodox doctrinally. There are fewer women now wanting a church wedding or a baptism for their babies. In Rhode Island, at least, I'm not too sure about other states, but my guess is the rate of church marriages is falling through the floor. This is the first time in centuries, maybe millennia, when this has been true, that women have been less religious than men. And it is not true for other young adult women in other Christian denominations. So Methodists or Episcopalian or Presbyterian or whatever millennial women and men are much less religious than their grandparents, but the women are still more religious than the men their age. I don't remember, maybe there's some historians here who remember a time when possibly in some of the early Middle Ages, but where the women were less religious than men. It doesn't happen. But it's happening in the United States and in other parts of the world. I know in Canada it's the same, in Western Europe it's the same, in Australia I've seen figures saying that the same thing is happening. Now, Nigeria, South Asia, it may very well be the women still are more active, but not in the West. Similarly, religious life and the priesthood was once the main way that working class and immigrant male Catholics could attain a professional career. If the story of the male religious orders is not told, the church may be less appealing to new generations of immigrants from Africa and Latin America who are themselves more likely to be working class. And I've seen studies of Pentecostal, los evangelicos, in this one, the one study that I saw was in Southern California. It basically said this is one of the few ways that Hispanic men can rise to a position of leadership. We already have lost almost half of the Latinos that entered this country. Throughout history, church leaders have recognized that losing the adherence of women and the working class is an existential threat and a repudiation of Christ's call to spread the good news. A story of North American Catholicism that does not contain, and again, Ginger said this last night, that does not contain and prominently highlight the story of all the varieties of leadership in Catholicism is partial, incomplete, and dangerous for the church's very survival here. The archives of women's and men's religious orders are essential for telling this story, and we are in grave danger of losing them to decay, disorganization, and sheer indifference. Also essential, of course, is to encourage more historians and social scientists to study religious life. That means the archives have to be accessible and easy to use, and that the academics have to be aware of the rich data they contain. To do this, archivists, leaders of religious orders, and scholars have to address an entire set of issues about which you are much more knowledgeable than I. And I don't have the background to answer them, or even adequately discuss them. What I've been asked to do today is to summarize the results of the 3 questionnaires, one of archivists, one of the leaders of women's religious orders, and one of historians or other academic scholars, that the conference organizers sent out ahead of time as a sort of conversation starter for the rest of your time together. I'm going to organize the rest of my talk around several topics which seemed to me to be the most frequently mentioned in these surveys, together with any differences between the 3 groups surveyed in who raised or did not raise a given issue. I will conclude by going back and reiterating the snarly ferociousness that I just said about why this conference is existentially important to the church in North America today. But as all of you undoubtedly know, there were these 3 surveys, and all 3 included closed questions where the respondents picked from a list of possible answers. Strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly, those kinds of Likert scales. They all 3 also included an open-ended question about what issues the respondent thought should be included in this conference. In addition to that, the archivist survey had 3 other open-ended questions. One on, are there any other resources that you would find helpful in your work as an archivist? One on, is your archivist facing any other challenges we didn't talk about? And are you aware of other challenges that Catholic religious archives in general are facing? So what I'm going to do is summarize some of the patterns in the answers, both to the open-ended questions and also to the closed questions. Okay, the first pattern that I saw, there was a constellation of issues mentioned around data preservation and management. The most commonly mentioned request in the answers to the open-ended question about what issues should be discussed at this conference concerned issues around managing and digitizing collections, the best way of doing that, what to digitize, what not to digitize. Some sort of Hamlet, digitize or not to digitize? That is the question. How to keep up with and pay for constantly improving technologies, and so on. Digitization issues, I told you I wasn't an archivist, were the most frequently mentioned by both archivists and leaders, and the 3rd most commonly mentioned by the scholars. Additionally, digitization and other forms of data management was the archivist's most commonly mentioned answer to the open-ended question on what challenges they face, or what the most challenges that other archivists face. And there was a closed-ended question on the archivist questionnaire that had, here's a bunch of challenges, which one is the most important, and had them rank them. And digitization was the most highly ranked challenge. Neither the leadership nor the scholars survey included a separate question, either open-ended or closed, on data preservation challenges, but both the leaders and the scholars ranked this issue highly in the one open-ended question they had. Okay, at this point, I noticed that, whenever I give talks and I say, X% said this and Y% said that, everybody falls asleep. So it's easier just to read some of the comments. Here's a comment from an archivist. The greatest challenge we face is digitization of fragile material and utilizing a digital database to effectively manage and search the collection. Another archivist. We have started digitizing collection to preserve information, but also making some available online. I think people underestimate the cost in time and money that are involved in these types of projects. That's an understatement. Here's a historian. The major issue facing all archival repositories is digitization. Increasingly, research is being done remotely. Can religious archival repositories afford the time and expense of digitization? The second most important issue that also came in this constellation of topics around data preservation and management was the merging of archives or their removal to a centralized location. That came up last night in the presentation, too. The issue was somewhat less frequently cited by scholars, although some did note the dilemma between keeping the archives local and moving them elsewhere. Linked to this issue was a concern voiced by approximately 10% of all three groups about what would happen if a religious community ceases to exist or declines to such an extent that they can no longer maintain their archives. The question of what to do with archives at a community's completion was also one of the most common responses to the archivist survey questions on the challenges that they face, both in their own archives and what they think archivists in general face. So here again, some comments from an archivist. Determining the site of a centralized archive near a vibrant research university in a geologically stable region of the country, et cetera, geologically stable, and providing for the ongoing upkeep of such a site in perpetuity is essential. And from a leader of a religious community, we would like more information about storing archives after completion or after the majority of present members are deceased and the newer members are so few in numbers that archives may not be meaningful to them as they regroup around the charism. Here's another archivist. We are one province of an international congregation. Our U.S. province is in the autumn of its existence. We need to determine what to keep of our present archival material, documentation, and artifacts, how and where these will be preserved, stored, managed, etc., as our numbers and properties face diminishment. And then this is a very insightful comment from a scholar. I am torn between the relevance of place and the the relevance of place and context for preservation and use by scholars, and the need to have a national database and access to online documents. On the one hand, traveling to mother houses where individual collections are stored allows the scholar access to the built environment, which is often one of the chief statements of values and goals of women religious and is not captured in documents or papers. But, on the other hand, seeing the range of activities of Catholic women religious, for example, across geography, time periods, and ethnic and racial groups, will be aided by the ability to survey many communities with information gleaned from databases and online documents and finding aids. So there, you know. Another thing, one of the questions on the closed questions on both the archivist and the leaders surveys, not on the scholars, the other two, was whether or not their communities were facing downsizing, merger, or completion. Some 70% of the archivists and leaders on their surveys said, yep, our community's facing that. And of the 70%, then there was a subsequent question that said, has your membership discussed this possibility? And, oh yeah, almost all of them had. And then there was a question that said, and do you have a plan for your archives? Half of the leaders said no. And another fourth said they didn't know if they did or not. And almost half of the archivists said no, 44%. Yes, whoops. So, 70% of these communities say we're merging, we're downsizing, we may actually go out of existence, but we don't have any plan yet for what's going to happen to our archives if that, happens. The third most important issue, again around this data management thing, was access to archival holdings, and this was mentioned several times last night in the presentations. This was by far the most commonly mentioned topic by the scholars, which figures, but it was also the third or fourth most commonly mentioned in the other two surveys, but there was a difference in emphasis. The scholars and the archivists were more likely to mention the need to have guides or maps that could be useful in locating information. The leadership responses were more likely to mention a concern over how to preserve confidentiality by limiting access and a fear of losing control if the archives were moved to a central location. Several scholars and archivists complained that some orders and dioceses were reluctant to open even century-old files because of confidentiality concerns. But many other scholars and archivists, however, acknowledged the validity of concerns about both access and confidentiality. So, here's an archivist. As monasteries and communities die in place, how will scholars find where the resources and deposits are located? How will they make sense of them? We need a roadmap for future scholars. Here's another archivist. We are facing a challenge of providing access while maintaining privacy. Another archivist. Providing equal and transparent access to collections in an effort to minimize the sense of secrecy or mystery about the Catholic Church and its religious. Another archivist. It's my observation that Catholic institutions write themselves out of American historical narrative by making access to historical records very difficult. And then from a historian, the sensorial attitude of some Catholic archives and archivists and the obstacles to historical research because of limits on accessing biographical files of deceased Catholic priests, nuns, children, and other material deemed sensitive is a problem, even if it's not the researcher's main topic. On the other hand, we got a leader saying, main problem is confidentiality, planned and regular removal of certain types of confidential documents. So there is, as was mentioned last night, there is a tension here. Both sides have a strong point that need to be considered. So anyway, that was one constellation of issues around data preservation, access, management, especially when communities are merging or going out of existence. A second constellation of issues were issues, less commonly raised but still important, were issues around recruiting and training personnel to manage the archives. This was the third most commonly mentioned issue in the open-ended question of the leaders' survey. So, the leaders had that one, what should we talk about at this conference? And it was the third most commonly mentioned issue was personnel and resources. Both the archivists and the leaders cited the need for funding to train and update professional archivists and for ways to recruit, train, and supervise volunteers. All three surveys also mentioned the dilemma of whether to hire a professional lay archivist who might not be familiar with the history and culture of the community, as compared with assigning a sister to the task who might be less professionally trained and already overcommitted with other community or ministry responsibilities. So here's a historian. For most religious archives, the crux of all the challenges relate to personnel. First, competent personnel cost money and do not usually come equipped with familiarity with the Institute. Religious are sometimes lacking in the skill set needed to operate an archive, or they are unfamiliar with best practices. And here's an archivist. Many archivists for religious congregations have little or no training and are not able to master the technological savvy required for today's work and for the future. Many are in their 7th, 8th, or 9th decade of life. Whoops. And although you realize that someone's in the 9th decade of life, they're in their 80s, okay? That's not as bad as it sounds, but still. And although they hold the institutional memory, they are not going to be able to master an electronic content management system or capitalize on other technological advancements in the field. Another archivist. The laity who have come into some religious archives to take over the position of archivist have very little knowledge of the interior workings of a religious congregation, thus not knowing what to retain and what to let go of. If a sister archivist, many times an elderly sister, is placed in charge, she too may have little knowledge of the history, and thus the task of organizing may become overwhelming. And this poor woman is another archivist. I'm early in my work in the archives. I offered to get into this work as the sister in charge is 95 years of age, but a walking encyclopedia of archivist knowledge. But I also have a part-time job with the university and another job in the community in addition to my archivist work. This woman's holding down 3 jobs, okay. Keeping our heads above water as we strive to continue our community archives is an important issue. Then there's a community leader. How to train newer members to take care of the archive for future generations is a problem. And then, okay, that was the last one. In the open-ended question about the challenges they faced, okay, many of the archivists complained of the shortage of space and insufficient staffing. Now, I learned a new word looking at this, lone arrangers. What's a lone arranger? Okay. These resource issues were the 3rd most commonly mentioned challenge the respondents faced in their own communities, and the 4th most commonly mentioned challenge that they thought was faced by communities in general. An archivist: no space and we're under the water pipes. This is not taken seriously here, exclamation point. All right. So, and then a historian: providing access and funding to smaller collections. And from a leader: because of the selling of mother houses, space is a major concern. What is most important to keep? The archivists had a list of challenges, again, that they were supposed to rank as a closed-ended question. And leadership support was not one that they gave a lot of importance to in the closed-ended question. But in the open-ended question on what is the greatest challenge, 15 to 20% of their responses, both to the challenge faced by your own community, challenge faced by communities in general, and what do you want discussed at the conference, 15 to 20% of their responses mentioned leadership support, lack thereof. Now, interestingly enough, few of the leaders or scholars mentioned this problem. So most of these are archivists now. In fact, all of these, except one, is an archivist. Considering what I walked into 18 months ago, leadership's expectations seem to be unrealistic at times. Reluctance on the part of community leadership to trust the professional advice of the archivist. I find that leaders and administrators have very little understanding of the work of archivists and therefore resist providing the resources needed. I would like to have the younger members of the community be more interested in learning our history and being more involved in contributing materials voluntarily to the archives. That's a thought, by the way. Even communities that have people entering, and there are some, these people are digital natives. They think in binary code. And, so they're not going to think about archives if they think about them at all. They're not going to think about them in the same way. Okay, and then this is an archivist who was he or she is at some Catholic organization that is not a religious community. I don't know if it's a hospital or a diocese or what. We have to make Catholic organizations aware of the benefits of hiring a well-qualified archivist, archive staff, to having a functional department. I feel as though the public sees the value of our archives and its collections more than our own organization does sometimes. Another archivist: my greatest worry is that aging communities and overworked younger sisters, and youngers in quotes, by the way, will have the archives at the bottom of the list of important concerns. And then here's a historian: leadership needs not only to be familiar with what archives do and how they function, they have to provide a mandate to make the archive integral to the institute's government. So much is lost without the backing of superiors. Okay, finally, there was a question for the archivist asking what help they would need. And it was a closed question, and of the 4 resources needed, by far the most often chosen was personal contacts that the respondents could call on for help or advice. There's very little interest in becoming a member of another formal group or association, probably because they're already swamped with work. Contact with other archivists was the most frequently mentioned resource given to the open-ended part of this question. Collaboration with other archivists also ranked fourth in the list of issues that archivists would like to be discussed at this conference, and was frequently mentioned by the leaders and the scholars as well. The archivists and the scholars especially wanted help in publicizing the riches of their holdings to more researchers, as well as exploring ways that the story of the community could be preserved and shared. Here's a historian. What help is needed? Providing access and funding to smaller collections, coordinating information on women's archives, and following the archives and the special collections of Catholic institutions in peril. Another historian. Bridging the gap between Catholic religious archives and non-religious archives that contain materials of interest to scholars of Catholicism. Get these folks talking to each other so we can find out where the material is. Considering issues around funding and research opportunities, strategic alliances between universities, religious, and funding resources. And then this is a leader of a congregation. We need best practices or examples of collaboration, both with internal congregational departments, by which I think they mean that their archives talks to their communications, their formation, their vocation, et cetera. But also the external organizations, i.e. local civic church organizations, historical societies. And another leader, collaborative approach to religious community archives and designated places where the story of women religious is told into the future. I think this goes until 10, but I wanted to stop at 9:30 if possible. Okay, so, and I'm on the second last page, so this should be feasible. I've sort of been watching my watch so that I would stop at 9:30 so that there would be a half an hour for, got it. Okay, so conclusions. This is where I jump on my soapbox and start screaming again. The story of the Catholic Church in North America is complex, with multiple voices and perspectives. In numerous times and places in the past, Catholicism, through its religious orders, has offered one of the few opportunities available to women or working-class men to use their talents and exercise leadership in the larger society. Back when I was a graduate student, I actually took a graduate course, one of the first that the University of Chicago deigned to offer, but this was, mind you, back in 1980, okay, in the sociology of gender. And I did a mini little research paper for said course that, it was probably the quality that you'd expect the first or second year graduate student to do, but nevertheless, what I did was I went to association directories. There was a professional association of hospital administrators, all hospital administrators in the country. And there's also a professional association of all college and university presidents. I went to the 1955 editions of these and looked at the percentage of CEOs of hospitals, presidents of colleges and universities that were female. And I found that 99.9% of hospital CEOs were male. It was in the 90s, I'm maybe exaggerating slightly, but not much. Of the women CEOs of hospitals, they were all nuns. Most college presidents were male. Of the few women college presidents, they were all nuns. So we provided an opportunity for John Cardinal Cody, okay? Father was a fireman. I mean, people with working class backgrounds that ended up in strong leadership positions. First, Catholic religious orders also served as a voice for those who had none, speaking out against the maltreatment of oppressed groups. So you have people like Bartolome Las Casas, the Dominican, who back in the 1500s kept writing back to Spain saying, the conquistadores are killing off the Indians and oppressing the black people, you got to stop this. Didn't work, but he was at least speaking up for them. You have the U.S. Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, anti-war movement, the Berrigan Brothers. You have, I have to give a little shout out to my own congregation. Recently, one of our sisters' cause for canonization was put up by the Diocese of, not us, the Diocese of Santa Fe, Sister Blandina Sigali, who was one of the first sisters of any communities sent out to the Colorado and New Mexico territory in the 1870s or 80s probably. Whenever, is Veronica in here? 70s or 80s? 1872. Thank you, Veronica. So, who nursed Billy the Kid's outlaws back to health, stopped lynchings, fought against human trafficking, and we have her journal, which has been reissued, published. If anybody, it's called At the End of the Santa Fe Trail. She had a wicked sense of humor. But in any case, they're full of surprisingly modern sensibility about the oppression of the Native Americans and the Mexicans in the American Southwest, in which she actually said, future generations will consider this a shame. So brief shout out. Religious orders discovered and highlighted new social needs, often living and working with the poor or working class and establishing institutions and services to meet their needs. And any of you can probably name ways that the congregations that you are either leaders of or historians for or archivists for did that. They created breathtaking works of art and music, Fra Angelico, Thomas Aquinas writing poetry that is still, sung in, Tantum Ergo, all of those are his. All the way down to Gregorian chant, all the way down to Corita Kent in the 1960s, creating works of art. Discovered new horizons, both scientifically and geographically. You have the Jesuit LaSalle going down mapping the Mississippi River. You have Gregor Mendel discovering genetics. Religious orders have always done this, and we continue to do it today. To allow Catholicism to be reduced by a less informed and frequently unsympathetic popular media to a caricature, misogynistic, hidebound, scientifically ignorant, and intolerant, is a betrayal of our mission to preach the good news. And by the way, that's the image that many people have of us. Another CARA research that I was only peripherally involved in that they did was of people who were raised, millennial people in their 20s and early 30s, who were raised Catholic and no longer identify with the Catholic Church. And my peripheral involvement in that is I did some telephone surveys with some of them taped. You have to bite your tongue, because professionally it's not right to say, no, you're wrong, don't give that answer. but I can't tell you how many people said, well, I was Catholic, but then I went to high school or college, and I took a biology class, and I realized that you Catholics can't believe in evolution, and so therefore, or Catholics can't believe in science, and so therefore, and I couldn't say, you're wrong. I couldn't say, no, they do. I just had to swallow and say, oh, really, that's very interesting. Who would want to join or remain in such an organization? Misogynistic, hidebound, scientifically ignorant, intolerant. And that's what's happening. Among millennials who were raised Catholic, a good 30 or 40% no longer identify with the Catholic Church. And another 40-some% are Catholic as a sort of background thing, but they don't ever go to church. They have no idea what the Catholic Church teaches. And the only reason that they're Catholic is because it's too much trouble to leave. And it's just, one of those things, only a small percentage, and I've seen several surveys, depending on how they define it, of millennials, people in their 20s and 30s, are these rigidly orthodox. There is only one story of Catholicism. Jesus said the Mass, the Tridentine Mass in Latin with the apostles and gave them communion on the tongue. I'm exaggerating a little, okay, but not much. That's only about 10 or, that's only, I've never seen it larger than 15%, and usually between 7 and 10% of millennial Catholics. And to allow only one story of Catholicism to be told by this cognitive minority, to smooth out the rich and multifaceted narrative of the Church into a single approved and ahistorical hagiography, risks alienating the 90% of the coming generations who will not be attracted to, who are turned off by this story. And who yet, and who then will remain ignorant of the other aspects of Catholicism's multifaceted narrative for which they unknowingly hunger. I have a book out there that you didn't mention because I didn't tell you, but you know, it's not a scholarly book, God help us. But it's this idea of, it's a little, I got shanghaied into writing this little pamphlet called Not Your Parents' Catholicism, or Your Grandparents' Catholicism. This guy, he's got a private publishing house, and he says he writes books for, quote, grandparents to give their grandchildren when they go off to college to keep them Catholic, end quote. So I gave him back, sent him back this little book, and it's short 4-page chapters that go, this is something that sociologists and psychologists say that bothers young people today. Did you know the Catholic Church has this neato cool thing that addresses that? And here's some websites. So, you know, the surveys that show young people have trouble making decisions. There's so many choices. Have you ever heard of something called discernment prayer? There's this guy named Ignatius Loyola, and this is what he did, and it's so cool. This is how it works, and here's some websites. You know, there's too much noise. And, you know, did you know that the Catholic Church has this cool thing called centering prayer? And besides that, there's Eucharistic adoration. And this is how it works, and here's some websites. You know, they hunger for this stuff, and they don't know we have it because the only image of Catholicism out there is one that only appeals to a minority of people. And suffice it to say, these are the people that fill our seminaries. Because if somebody has already rejected the Catholic Church, or it's Catholicism is just a sort of background thing that is so peripheral they can't be bothered renouncing it, they're not going to join the seminary. So, okay. I believe that it is literally, here's where I get in the soapbox, this is literally an existential crisis for Catholicism in North America. If we don't want Catholicism in this country to dwindle, as it is already dwindling, into a vague cultural background, or into a small society of the pure that excludes everybody else. If we yield our ability to tell our story to a popular media that conflates Catholicism with narrow-minded Protestant evangelicals, and by the way, narrow-minded Protestant evangelicals is also unfair to them. If we allow the history of Catholicism to be forgotten as these archives molder into dusty or mildewed boxes, then something very precious will be lost. I'm not an archivist, but I am a sociologist. And I say that what you are here to discuss and act upon is quite simply the most important issue facing Catholicism in North America and Western Europe today. Period.
We have a little time if anybody would like to ask Sister Patricia any questions. It was a rousing talk, as I thought it would be. And I'm sure it will be great food for discussion in the breakout sessions following this presentation. We'll have a break right outside. Sister Patricia.
I think there are mics down here. While someone is thinking of what to say, I'll tell you a horror story. In Indianapolis, I heard that one of the seminarians said, "Why are we paying so much attention to sisters? They've never done anything anyway." Keep coming. Come.
This is really probably for Malachy. I just wondered, what's the breakdown of leaders, historians, and archivists attending?
I would say there's roughly a little less than 30 leaders, a little less than 40 scholars / special collections people, and the rest would be archivists. There's probably about 110 archivists here. But we purposely tried to do this so that all groups could begin to discuss this issue. The other thing, as you're probably well aware, all the talks are being videotaped, will be on the website, so that you can share them with your community, or if you need some support, these talks will be available for leadership to look at, or scholars, or other archivists. But this is just the beginning.
I didn't mean to scare you half to death. Please ask some questions. Okay.
Pat, I'm really interested in the whole idea that 10%.
Mm-hmm.
What is the percentage, in this you may not know, of that 10% that has been homeschooled?
A much larger percent than of the millennial population as a whole, by several orders of magnitude. I'm not sure that question has ever been asked. I do know that there's been some studies done of some of the conservative religious communities. This would be, or some of the communities that are getting young people. By the way, not all religious communities inhabited in CMSWR are getting members. But your Sisters of St. Cecilia, Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia of Nashville, also the male Dominicans. I've seen some studies of some of them, and what was that, 10%? It was an amazingly high percentage of them, entering. The ones that enter were homeschooled.
I think it's also interesting, I'd like to know the percentage of those who actually stay. What I've heard is that that they leave about the same as apostolic communities.
Yeah, for a long time it was customary or a habit or something for LCWR religious communities to say, well, those people are entering, but they're all leaving. They're not all leaving. The most recent figures I've seen on this, and these are very old, you're right, it's about the same percentage. About, in the 1990s it was half, but it was half of all of communities. It's probably a little better than that now, because the screening's better. And the orders vary wildly. I have a friend who's a Nashville Dominican, so I greatly respect them. The point more is that the pool is smaller. The Nashville Dominicans get about 20 people entering a year. Even if they keep only 10 of them, and I think they keep slightly more than that. But another problem with leaving is any study I've ever seen of people leaving stops at final vows. And as you all know, that is not necessarily, and if someone leaves after final vows, that won't show up in the leaving figures. But anyway, the Nashville Dominicans get about 20 people a year. In 1950, the city of Nashville had 2 religious congregations, the Diocese of Nashville, each getting 20-some people a year, because there was a Sister of Mercy group there, too. Nashville is not a very Catholic town. A city the size of Nashville that was more Catholic, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, would have 4 or 5 religious orders getting, well, 4 maybe, getting 20 people a year. And a city the size of Chicago would have 7 or 8 religious orders getting 20 people a year. New York had 8 groups of Dominicans getting 20 people a year. Now, in order to get 20 people a year, the National Dominicans draw from the entire country. Because it's only that 10%. If all millennials were as interested in the religious life as previous, we wouldn't be able to build mother houses fast enough. Okay, I was ignoring a hand over here for a very long time, and I apologize.
That's okay. Not sure where to start here. I'm a leader. I'm also a newer member, so some of us do care about our histories and our archives. I'm also a Gen Xer, not a millennial, but I did leave the church for a good 12 years, so I understand that motivation there. My question, both for you and I think for others here, is we tend to focus, at least in formation, so much on our founding story, our founding history. What I think is being lost right now with the generations that are passing is the story of renewal and all that has happened since then, because the sisters, as we learned last night, don't like to talk about it and just take it for granted. So I'm wondering, both for yourself and then for the archivists and the leaders and historians here, how can we make an emphasis on capturing the whole story and the current story so that it's not lost? Because otherwise, the few of us that are still here in 20, 30 years, I always joke, are going to tell the story about the one nun who did everything, because I can't differentiate between who did what. But are there examples of the interrelation with the other departments we've heard? What about with formation in the archives?
What about what in the archives?
Formation departments having a collaborative relationship with the archives as well.
Oh, yeah. And I know that this happens in my own community's archives quite a bit. But one of the things that it probably would be important to remember is that history is, as you say, still going on. So that, as one novice, and this is back in the 80s, or early 90s, said to Barbara Hagedorn, actually, at that point, she wasn't our community leader yet, she was a director of formation, quote, Vatican II, that's all you talk about, like it happened yesterday. And and there's a lot of history that's gone on since Vatican II. And if we don't tell that history, it's going to be lost too. One of the things I thought about last night with the presentation, and if I throw this out, I might scare everybody, and you might all go home in despair. I don't know, but this business of who gets access to your archives and what do they do with it. I don't know if you've ever read a book, and she's a journalist. Okay, she's not a historian, by Anne Carey called Sisters in Crisis. Okay, some people are nodding. Okay, I don't know that she had access to religious orders archives, but she did, obviously, to the archives of LCWR, but the story that she tells of what happened to religious orders after Vatican II is very one-sided and I think misinterpreted. What happens when someone gets a hold of archival material and has an axe to grind? And she ground a rather thorough axe. One of which, if any of you have read it, you know she ground it rather thorough. But what her point basically was, to be honest, that religious orders were full of, they had some outdated customs that drove people nuts and that was a good idea to get rid of, but they were full of devout, holy, pious sisters in 1965. And then Vatican II happened, and evil members of LCWR, with an evil intent of destroying religious life, took over, and brainwashed all the nuns who followed them like sheep. And if they hadn't been these evil leaders, all the sisters would have stayed very docilely in their convents, and they wouldn't have all left. And somebody needs to tell an alternative story about that, badly. So don't forget that I lay another burden on you in addition to, deciphering Mother Mary Cunegonde's or whoever's, letters from the 1820s. Don't forget what was going on between, say, 1970 and 1990. It is a story that needs to be told. Yeah, it's ignoring it. So.
I'm wondering if you got a sense from the surveys about what percentage of archivists also have to act as the institution's scholar or researcher. I was at a workshop a few weeks ago with other archivists where that was not expected of them at all, because they were at corporate institutions or city institutions, and they were basically just working on archival work. But it seems like within religious institutions, you also need to spend all your free time as a researcher. And I'm just wondering if you got a sense from the surveys if that's true across.
I don't think there was a question about there. The first question was, how much of your time do you devote to working in the archives? And only about half, 54%, were full-time. Another 13% were half-time, and then the rest were either, fit in only when time allows, a couple hours a week, only when necessary, a sort of thing. I don't think that answers your question, though, because I think the question you're asking is, if you got a full-time archivist, are they actually doing archival work, or are they trying to research the community's history at the same time? And I don't know. Do you know?
I would say this just as from an archival point of view, from an archivist point of view. You do have to know, I think, you have to know your history in order to run the archives. So you have to know, one of the things I always, when I hired my associate archivist, I just said, for 3 months, I want you to read all the documents about the Claretians. Now, fortunately, she's bilingual, so she read them all in Spanish, which I could never manage. But basically, I think that's a critical thing. So I think the big distinction is that it's not up for you to interpret the documents. It's up for you to understand them, to properly label them, and to properly develop finding aids where people know what you have. The function of interpreting the document is the historian, and the reason why you want historians or scholars to come into your collection, they know a far broader context, like we talk about, the renewal. They know what's happening in the secular world and other religious communities, and it's let them do that. It's not the function of the archivist, but the archivist has to know how to contextualize the materials. So they have to know the history cold, as Veronica said, 1872. So, and this is going to be the last question, then we'll take, two questions, then we'll take a break.
I'll do it fast, I hope. Thank you very much. The situation is pretty the same as you described that what we face in Canada, or at least in the province of Quebec. Since we're talking numbers, I thought maybe you'd be interested, how much does it cost to get archives services together, either for congregations or dioceses? I have at least two examples. In Winnipeg, Manitoba, 5 congregations decided to give their archives to the Saint Boniface Historical Society. They gave to the Historical Society their archives plus 650,000 Canadian dollars to get the project on wheel. But they have pledged to gather $2 million by 2021 so that the center could be viable. And in Sherbrooke, in the province of Quebec, 4 congregations gave their archives to the Diocese of Sherbrooke. The diocese had to raise $1 million to get the locals ready to have the archives installed. And the Quebec government added to that million $600,000. So roughly, no, if we want to make it short, for $2 million, you can have your center. And that's Canadian dollars, so.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it's my impression that may be wrong, is that Canadian orders, since both their schools and their hospitals were subsidized by the state in ways that U.S. orders were not, that they are financially better off and can afford this, whereas you get, you know, some little bitty religious order, they can, when I taught at Fordham, I lived with a sister from a New York community, which I will not name, who was in leadership at the time. And she mentioned one night that they were having a discussion in their leadership council on whether they could afford to paint one of the bathrooms. I don't know how many cans of paint it takes to paint a bathroom, but if they can't afford 2 cans of paint, they're going to have a hard time affording $4 million to fix their archives. Okay.
One aspect of the changing face of the Catholic Church in the world that I have not heard mentioned so far is one that I have experienced in our congregation, and that is that in the numbers that we have increasing in South Asia, in Africa, and some countries of South America, what we are conscious of is that many of the women are coming from cultures that are based on an oral tradition. And so their appreciation of the written record
Exactly.
just is not there. And try as one might, we're trying to overcome and change a whole mindset that goes back millennia.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and I think there are no other questions. I think that was supposed to be the last one, but if I can leave you with one last thing. When you do talk about the various issues, and these are, I can't tell you how important these are, but when you do talk about them, I don't know if I mentioned enough, the idea of spreading this out, you know, letting, you know, collaboration with local historical societies, the getting even something in the newspaper, whatever is, you know, to get this, to tell, if we don't tell the story, somebody's else going to tell it for us, and it's going to be a really, it's going to be a story we don't want told, because it's not going to be accurate. It's not going to, and then if the sister I live with said I should tell you this, so I will. She was a medical missionary in Armenia for 5 years. When all those countries became independent of the Soviet Union, LCW, anyway, she was over there for 5 years. She recently got an invitation to a mega celebration. Their mother house is in Rome. The sisters that she lived with were celebrating their 170th anniversary, which is kind of an odd anniversary to celebrate. So she went over to Rome, she had a great time and all this sort of thing, brushed up on her Armenian and all that, and she came back and she said, the reason they had it, she said it's an odd anniversary for them too, but recently you may have noticed was the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. The sisters in this community were the first 4 women executed by the Turkish government. There are story upon story upon story of their persecution. They took in thousands of Armenian orphans in the diaspora. By the way, most of these people don't minister in Armenia, they minister in Iraq, they minister in all these different places. Even in the United States, there's some of them in Pennsylvania, I'm told, wherever the Armenians ended up after the genocide. Not one mention was made in the major, in any of the news reports, and there's several histories being written of the Armenian genocide as a part of all of this 100th anniversary. Not one mention of the role of the sisters. And so the current leader said, well, we're going to do something about that. We're going to have a 170th anniversary in Rome. We're going to make a big thing out of it. Somebody's got to do this. Somebody's got to tell the story.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Patricia. An excellent talk. So we are going to take a break right outside. Now, again, on the back of your name tags is the yellow with a number, and that's where the breakout sessions will occur in the Heights room, which where we were this morning for breakfast. All right, so enjoy. Thank you.